If you're listening to this podcast, it means you're ready, no, more than ready, to have a major breakthrough in your business. You're hungry for change and you're hungry for growth, and that's why you're feeding your mind right now with all of this valuable information. But to drive those changes, to be really smart about what you're doing and to make the right choices before you take massive action, you need help from someone who's been there, someone who's going to coach you through it, even just someone to get you started on your journey. That's why Tony Robbins is offering a free one-to-one business strategy session from one of his top business coaches, a $600 value, completely free, no strings attached. That's right. If you're listening right now, you can go to tonyrobbins.com/CEO and sign up for a free session with a member of Tony's team who's helped business owners like yourself overcome their obstacles and set them on the path to success. Welcome to the Tony Robbins podcast. I'm your host, Annie Org. Have you ever wondered how the most successful companies make their hires? Or what makes for a winning team? Have you ever wanted to know what characteristics distinguish the most innovative entrepreneurs? Or what makes someone truly original? We do. That's why we sat down with the renowned organizational psychologist, Adam Grant. Adam is the guy that companies like Google call when they're trying to solve the big problems. He's been recognized as Wharton's top-rated teacher for 5 straight years. He's been named one of the world's 35 most influential management thinkers, and he's been on Fortune's 40 Under 40 list. His TED Talk on original thinkers has more than 5.5 million views, and he's authored 2 New York Times best-selling books. Actually, he's just co-authored a new book with Sheryl Sandberg called Option B. It's about facing adversity, building resilience, and finding joy. I sat down with Adam to discuss just how businesses can get the most out of their employees, and how employees can get the most out of their jobs. We dug into the personality dynamics of givers and takers, innovators, and original thinkers. And we talked about why it's so important to not just meet customer expectations, but to exceed them. So Adam Grant, welcome to the Tony Robbins podcast.
Thank you.
All right. So the first question I wanted to ask you, this is a little bit of an odd one, but I was looking, as I mentioned earlier in the bio, you have this award that says goes above and beyond the call of duty for MBA teaching from Wharton. What does that mean exactly?
I have no idea. It just appeared one day.
That's all of a sudden. There was no specific example that they gave you?
It's a mystery. I did ask at some point, and I was told that I spend an unusual amount of time doing office hours to try to give students advice and answering emails and fielding calls with them. But your guess is as good as mine.
So when you're doing office hours, since it is, business, do you get pitched a lot of ideas, or do they kind of use you as a sounding board to help figure out if there's something that they should pursue?
They used to. And then I wrote about this bonehead decision I made to pass on investing in Warby Parker. And no one wants to pitch me anymore. No, actually, I guess the stream of pitches has gone up consistently, especially after writing a whole book about original thinkers, which includes, a bunch of examples and data points on entrepreneurs. And I always tell them in response, look, my expertise is people, not necessarily, how to run a business. And so you should take everything I say with as many grains of salt as you can put together.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mentioned Warby Parker, because I know that's a story that you mention in the originals, and a few times you use that as an example when you speak. But I ran into Neil Blumenthal recently because we were at a Tony Robbins event, his business mastery event, and as sort of a new format for that event, we had a panel of speakers. And so it was Neil from Warby Parker, it was Melanie Willen from SoulCycle, and then Joe Gebbia from Airbnb. And I asked them individually what was different about this. And instead of sort of responding with that, it was really high energy, all 3 of them independently said, backstage before the panel, we're so used to people just saying, hey, get out, tell your story, everybody's going to love it, the sort of standard stuff. They're like, Tony took us aside and he said, okay, what can I do for you? What can I give to you now, whether it's advice or, some water, whatever it is, that will help you be great? And I thought of that story because one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today is your idea of givers and takers. So people are often surprised when people are openly giving, just as Neil, Melanie, and Joe were really surprised that Tony had been very giving before this big event. I'd love to just hear a little bit about how you see giving and taking within organizations and how to identify those types of givers and takers.
Yeah, it's totally fascinating to me. I always assumed, Anna, that like the nicer somebody was, the more generous they were. And, if somebody seemed to be critical, skeptical, challenging, must be more selfish. And I started gathering a bunch of data and found that there was like no correspondence between those attributes. So giving and taking is all about your inner motives. What are your intentions toward others, right? Is your stance, what can I do for you, or what can you do for me? And there's a totally separate trait called agreeableness, which is your outer veneer. How pleasant is it to interact with you? And so, it's easy to recognize the agreeable givers who are both nice and generous, and the disagreeable takers who are just jerks across the board. But,
easy to identify. Yep.
Exactly. But the other two combinations throw us off a lot. There are a lot of disagreeable givers out there who, on the surface are gruff and tough, but underneath they have others' best interests at heart. And too often we write them off and say, yeah, that person's kind of prickly, must be a selfish taker. When in reality, those are the people who give us the critical feedback that we don't want to hear, but need to hear. And they're the very best champions of change because they're the people who aren't afraid of challenging the status quo. And then on the flip side, the agreeable takers are the ones that you really have to watch out for. Those are the fakers who are really nice to your face, and then they stab you right in the back. And I think most of the screening that we end up doing is to say, look, just because someone is friendly does not mean that person actually cares about you. And it might be fun to chat about what are the signs that person actually is an agreeable taker.
Yeah, how can you tell?
Well, one of the easiest patterns to look for is kissing up and kicking down. Takers are great fakers when dealing with powerful people because they know that's how you get ahead. You impress someone in a position of influence with your generosity. But then they learn it's a lot of work to pretend to care about everybody. And they end up letting their guard down with peers and subordinates who see more of their true colors. So it's a red flag if somebody has a great reputation upward, but it's more mixed lateral and downward. That also means bosses are the worst references on character because anybody can go to any taker can line up a few bosses to say nice things about them. It's really the people that have been below them or next to them who get to see those true colors.
So it's almost like you need a peer review as opposed to an official review from a managerial team.
Exactly. And sometimes you don't have access to that. And the only thing you can do is try to pick up, is there a history or a reputation of selfish behavior? But sometimes you can actually learn things from the conversations you have with them. So one of the things we all do when we interview people is we ask, tell me about your greatest successes and failures. And we ought to go the extra step and say, tell me what caused your success and what caused your failure. And that's when you start to see that the takers are the ones who use more I's and me's when talking about accomplishments. And they're much more likely to blame their failures and mistakes on other people and throw them under the bus, which is kind of a useful thing to pick up. Yeah. And then one other favorite way to spot an agreeable taker, especially, actually, Anna, we'll try this out. So let's take a taking behavior. Yeah, watch out.
I'm nervous.
We're about to assess you. But
okay.
Let's take a taking behavior like theft. So stealing from your company. It could be cash, materials, merchandise, intellectual property. Mm-hmm. The question is, what % of people do you think steal at least $10 in a typical month from their employer?
At least $10 in a typical month. I would think it's pretty high because they might be doing it, but have sort of convinced themselves that it's not stealing. So maybe 70%.
Ooh, you're close on this one.
Ooh.
So I don't actually know what the real answer is, and I don't care.
Okay.
But I care a lot about what you think the answer is. Because the data show that the higher your estimate that other people are thieves, the greater the chances that you're a thief.
Oh, snap.
Luckily, you didn't go over 80% because then we'd all have to check our wallets.
And I also, hey, you know what? And I moralized too. Because I was thinking, other people might justify it. but
No,
I
see,
don't.
look, you're off the hook. You're totally off the hook. But what's interesting is when people answer that question, most of the time they ask themselves, what would I do or what have I
Mm,
done? And then they project that onto others.
mm-hmm.
So you get an extreme taker to answer this question, and it's like, what percent of people steal $10 from their company? Because takers always talk that way.
Yeah,
And
obviously.
they're like, last week I stole $372. I'm assuming 10 a month is common, 98%.
Wow. Or they'll be they would, almost take it to the opposite extreme and just say, well, everybody does it, right? But there must
Which
be a
is
few
exactly
a few, goody two shoes that don't, so I'll just lower it by a few percentage points.
that's exactly right. And that's why I liked your logic so much. What you see with a lot of givers is they'll just say, like, how do you even steal $10 from a company? Like, how many pens do you have to take home
Yeah.
to add? It's like 45. But
Wow.
interestingly, takers do anticipate more selfish behavior from others,
Mm-hmm.
and that's part of how they justify and rationalize being a taker. It's not
Mm.
me. All of you people are selfish, so I'm just being smart and cautious by protecting myself. And so the way that I like to apply this is to say, look, no one question's ever going to do the trick completely, but pick the taking behavior you're most worried about. It could be stealing credit for others' ideas. It could be dumping grunt work on others. And it might even be just hoarding or hiding knowledge instead of sharing it freely. And you ask people to predict how common that is. And then if they give a high estimate, you ask them why. And an explanation like yours is absolutely legitimate. The deadly one is when people say, I believe that others are fundamentally selfish, which is code
Mm.
for I am fundamentally selfish.
Wow. This is so tricky. I'm definitely going to use that. So if taker, it sounds, it's a little bit discouraging because now it sounds like takers are everywhere. And you had an interesting quote. You said takers rise quickly, but fall quickly at the hands of matchers. So I understand the first part, right? So they could potentially, because on the surface, especially if they're agreeable takers, they could rise quickly within the ranks of an organization and be in positions of power, which is frightening, right? But what are some of the ways that they either hit a limit or, like you said, they fall quickly at the hands of matchers? What does that mean?
Yeah. So what's interesting is relatively few of us are pure givers or takers. We do have a default, right? So if you're a giver, you're much more focused in the majority of your interactions on, how can I help? What can I contribute? And if you're a taker, you're much more likely to focus on, how can I get ahead? But what most of us do is in the vast majority of our interactions at work, we choose this third style called matching, where we say, basically, look, I'll do something for you if you do something for me. And that way we're playing it safe, right? We're not being too selfish. We're not being too generous. And what's great is in the data I have, well over half of people worldwide self-identify as matchers, as like that being their default style when they meet somebody new. And matchers believe in an eye for an eye, right? The just world, what goes around comes around. And when it doesn't, they're the people who love to punish takers because it's not fair if you're a taker and you act selfishly and you get away with it. So matchers like to become the karma police. And if you're a true matcher, when you meet a taker, you just think to yourself, like, it's my mission in life to punish the hell out of this person, right?
Yeah,
And
that
deliver
guy's
the
going
sword of
down.
justice.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, well, if most people are matchers and they're motivated to punish takers, how do they do that? And you see that there's a small percentage of people who will deliberately feed takers false information to try to sabotage them. But most matchers choose a more subtle, deadly weapon, which is called gossip.
Ooh.
And it usually goes something like this. Hey, Anna, don't trust this guy. He's a selfish bastard. And that makes it really hard for takers to sustain their success because they can't just screw over a bunch of people and then expect to start over fresh in all their new relationships. Some of those people are going to be matchers who are making sure that their reputation follows them. And that's how a lot of takers fall is, they do enough kicking down that it ends up coming back to bite them.
Yeah. So, you just wrote an article that was super interesting in your LinkedIn influencer column, and it was called How to Change a Selfish Person's Stripes. And the idea was that, in many cases, we don't have control over who is in our organization. So you might have these matchers who are, sort of they're being the karma police, right? But in a lot of cases, if that's not working, or if you can't fire the takers or even avoid collaborating with them, how do you make the best of that situation? So are there tricks that you can use to either mitigate or even shift the behavior of a taker to one of a giver?
Oh, one of my favorite questions. I don't think it's easy to change a taker's stripes, but it is worth recognizing that very few people are takers in every relationship, and those people are called psychopaths.
Yep.
So for the rest of takers, right, there's some data from Japan suggesting that, less than 10% of people will just relentlessly pursue their own interests without concern for others. And so, the majority of takers are operating that way either because, they're narcissists, they believe in a zero-sum world where if I want to win, everyone else has to lose, or they've just been burned one too many times. And, they kind of walked away thinking, like, I have to put myself first or else no one else will. And so if you understand that, one of the things you can do is realize, look, like most takers are generous in some of their interactions, or they're at least, there are times when they're less selfish, and you want to observe the fluctuations in their behavior and then figure out, all right, those moments where they helped others, like, what did those moments have in common? And what does that suggest about, is there a certain kind of expertise they love to share? Is there a group of people they're passionate about helping? And then you start tailoring those requests to the kinds of giving that they gravitate toward. Mm-hmm. And then they start to get known for helping in that way, and then they're trapped. They have to do it, which is great. And then the other way that I think can be really effective, although I would say try this one at your own risk, is a financial services company a few years back. There's a woman named Kathy who got a big promotion, and she was told that she was going to co-lead a new team with this guy that today I'm going to call Colin because that's his name. And she had 4 different people warn her, do not trust Colin. He's going to steal a bunch of your ideas, and he's going to dump the most unpopular work on you. Watch your back with this guy. Mm-hmm. And Kathy sat down in their very first meeting together and did something that very few people have the courage to do. She said, hey, Colin, I understand we're going to be leading this team together, and I just wanted to let you know, this is what I've heard about you.
Whoa.
And she shares all the reputational feedback.
Wow.
And Colin's
she's just upfront about it.
Totally. She calls a spade. And yeah, Colin sort of sheepish. And he says, I don't know who you've been talking to, but those people are clearly all jealous of me.
Oof.
Like, okay, now
look
we
in the
know
mirror,
you're a
buddy.
taker.
Yeah.
Yep. But what's so interesting is for the next year and a half, Colin changes his stripes. And he shares credit. He mentors people below him. He volunteers for really undesirable projects. And I think the beauty of what Kathy did is that she made his reputation visible to him, and then she gave him a chance to earn a new one. And what she said, in closing that conversation, I think really stuck, which was she said, I don't know whether this is true or not, but I hope it's not true because I don't work well with people who operate this way. And if this is who you are not going to like working with me. Message delivered. So sometimes takers don't realize that they're operating that way or that they're known that way, and making it more visible to them can help them reform.
Yep. I think you also mentioned too, as part of that is that if you make clear to the person that their behavior is undermining their own goals, right, and they're not going to, they're basically acting against their self-interest. So if you can identify, right, what their outcomes are, and then if you show them how their behavior is not helping them achieve those outcomes, that's another way to sort of shift their behavior.
Yeah, I think one of the virtues of dealing with takers is that if they're really that selfish, at least they're predictable. Right? If you know what their interests and goals are, then you can anticipate what they're going to care about. And in a world that's more connected than ever before, where relationships and reputations tend to drive the economy, whether you have a service job or you work in a team or you're an entrepreneur that has to fundraise and sell, in all of those conditions, right? In the long run, being a taker really works against you. And there are very few people who want to trust you or work with you. And so sometimes just helping takers connect those dots and realize being a taker might seem like the shortest path to success, but it's also one of the riskiest over time.
Hmm.
Maybe I should rethink that.
Yeah. So if that's, from a peer perspective, that makes a lot of sense, right? So if you're an organization, these are some of the things you can do. What if you are a business owner? And I say business owner and want to emphasize owner, because one of the concepts that Tony teaches at Business Mastery is that a lot of people think that they're a business owner, but they're actually a business operator. So they're in the day to day and they're really involved in the day to day operations of the business, which from, this perspective, then you can identify the takers and you can really be in on the ground and help shape your company culture. But if you're a business owner, you're a little bit removed from the day to day. So if you're a business owner, and you really have responsibility to create a culture where everybody can excel, and where specifically, to your point, where givers can excel because they're not the ones who are rising quickly up through the ranks, right? What are some of the things that you can do to cultivate that kind of environment?
One of the biggest mistakes that I see business owners making is they say, look, we want generosity. We want people to help each other solve problems. And that's the right spirit of collaboration.
Oh, yeah. And they put it all, in the values and the mission. It's all written down, right?
It is. Yeah. And then they only measure and promote and reward on individual achievements.
Yeah.
Which is, great way to create a world where takers succeed. And I think that, obviously changing that is really critical. And so then the question is how? Best example I've seen is at Corning, where they made the Gorilla Glass originally for the iPhone and the iPad. Mm-hmm. And they have scientists and engineers there where they have this Corning Fellows program. If you get named a fellow, you have a job for life and a lab for life, which is pretty cool.
Wow. Is it like being a tenured professor?
Even better, I think. Because, you have a real job. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is when they go to select their fellows, one of the factors is, can you drive, breakthrough innovative performance? And so, like a lot of the fellows will be the lead author on a patent that's worth 100 million US or more. And most companies would stop there, right? If you can drive that kind of innovation, we want to lock you up for life and throw away the key.
Sure.
Corning says, no, we're worried that competent takers will pollute the culture and that if we give them permanent job security, their contributions will dwindle over time. And so they have this other set of criteria, which includes, are you a supporting author on other people's patents? And I think this is ingenious because it can take a decade to finish a patent. And there are not a lot of takers who are like, you know what, Anna, I'm going to pretend to help you for the next 7 years, in the hopes that you will reward my false generosity by making me the 43rd author on your patent, right? Not going to happen.
Not going to happen.
It's the people who day in and day out, share their knowledge and, try to support each other and solve problems that end up getting those later authorships. And Corning says you got to do both. You have to show that you can drive your own results, but also that you can elevate the results of other people. And I think these kinds of dual performance evaluation, reward, promotion metrics, I think they're so key. And I guess the question for anyone running a business is, what's your equivalent of later patent authorship? What are those signs that somebody is day in, day out contributing to the success of others? And how do you make sure that gets rewarded?
Sure. It's like KPIs for the internal culture of your company.
It is, or it's like, a basketball team, making sure that you measure assists and block shots, not just points scored. Mm-hmm. And then go even further and say, all right, there are a lot of intangibles too. So, let's look at how well our team does when each player is on the court versus off the court, and know who's really improving our ability to win and excel.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's something that's really challenging, identifying those secondary metrics, but it sounds like it's absolutely essential for the company's long-term success.
I think it is. And it's not about incentivizing giving, right? We don't want to motivate takers to be better fakers. I think it's more about just taking away the disincentives to giving and saying, look, there are plenty of people who would love to be helpful. They just want to know that they're not going to be punished for it, and that, it is valued behavior around here.
Yep. So those are some great principles, right? This whole giving taking idea to building a winning team. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about what it takes to build a winning company, right? So on the external, those external markers. So one of the things that Tony tells entrepreneurs a lot is he just says, you know what, the core thing you need to do is you have to add more value than anyone else. So you have to meet and exceed the expectations of your customers, because when you do that, you get raving fans. So satisfied customers, it sounds like what everybody wants. That's not what you want. Those people go away. Raving fans are the ones that stay. So I'm curious. So, you're an organizational psychology genius and someone who's just intensely studied human behavior and what motivates people. So flipping the switch a little bit and looking to people who are looking for, product market fit, but also understanding how to position their product or their service to, consumers. Can you give us an idea of what you think is motivating people now more than ever, right? Why do people buy what they buy? Like, what is it? Convenience? Is it quality, price? Is there some sort of cultural shift going on where consumers are starting to value some things more than others that our audience might not be aware of?
I have to say I'm really torn on this one. And you should definitely not believe anything I'm about to say, because
of course not.
as an organizational psychologist, I spend all my time thinking about people at work, and it's really consumer psychologists who are experts on the marketing and customer side of the equation. But
Sure.
I think obviously like, people don't sort themselves into buckets, right? Like I have a job and I'm also a consumer, and I'm not a fundamentally different person in those two roles, I hope. So here's what I've observed. I think, first of all, I think Tony is right on target. When he says, look, not just meeting customer expectations, but exceeding it is critical. And I think that's one of the mechanisms for that is actually because most consumers, by default, just like most employees, are matchers. Mm-hmm. Right? They believe that generosity deserves to be rewarded in the same way that selfishness should be punished. Mm-hmm. And so when you go above and beyond for a customer who's expecting you to be fair and meet expectations, right, you trigger that basic justice motive to say, all right, like this company went above and beyond. And now, I want to make sure that, not only do they benefit from it directly, because I'll buy more products, but, I also want to spread the word and refer customers because this is a company with good values. Mm-hmm. And, I think that one of the things that speaks to is consumers are constantly asking, how do I know if I can trust a company? How do I know if I can trust your products or your services? And if you look at the research, trust actually breaks down into three dimensions. There's the basic dimension of competence, which is, are you able to deliver? And do you have the capabilities and skills to do what you say you're going to do? Mm-hmm. And then the other two dimensions are really more about character. So one dimension is benevolence, which is, do you actually care about your customers, or are you just about profits? And that's where, actual brands can be judged as givers and takers, just like people can. And then the third dimension, which I think is becoming more and more critical in recent years, is integrity, which is, you might be perfectly competent and I might see you as benevolent, but do I agree with your principles? And do I think that you're going to follow through on them so that, your actions actually match your words? And people don't necessarily pay a lot of attention if you establish integrity, but when you violate it, watch out, right? That's when consumers will run screaming in the other direction or cry foul. Mm-hmm. And I think we're going to see in the years to come more and more emphasis placed on how to, as a consumer, how do I judge whether you really have integrity and whether your words are going to match your deeds?
Sure. And it's insane too how quickly things blow up. I mean, look what just happened just this past week with Uber and Lyft, right? I mean, just the very idea that a slight action. I mean, it wasn't like a huge thing, but it was interpreted as like a travesty. and one hashtag. I feel like every brand is one hashtag away from some major negative publicity, and there are so many competitors that are just waiting for to leverage the fact that their competitor is being criticized for something. And sometimes it has to do with politics, right? But sometimes it's things that are outside of what's going on in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't help but notice when you said travesty, no pun intended. But I mean, yeah, I think we've all known as long as we can remember thinking about this, that the trust is much easier to destroy than it is to rebuild. And I think that at some level, we're going to see more and more consumers who feel like it's their responsibility to be watchdogs and make sure that the brands really are living up to their promises. And I think that actually circles back to me. Then you ask, like, okay, what is it that really drives how people treat their customers? And one of the most robust predictors of whether you're going to do right by your customers is whether you treat your employees right. There's a huge spillover effect of how employees are treated, on how they end up treating their customers. And that's why I'm sort of dumbfounded every time I see a company that says we put customers first. No, you don't put your customers first. You put your employees first, and then you can trust that your employees will be more likely to put their customers first.
Yep. This actually just happened. There was a Inc. 5000 conference, and the CEO of Gravity stood up and was talking to Tony just about what had happened recently with his company. Are you familiar with that story, by the way? The Gravity?
Yeah, they had paid like a minimum wage of $70,000 a year per employee, right?
Exactly. Yep. And there was, there were some sort of nuances around it that kind of got put aside, but the gist of it was that his employees then pooled together their money, and this is everybody from management to customer service, and they bought him his dream car, which was a Tesla. And Tony's point in that interaction with the CEO was, look, you treated your employees like they were your customers, right? You put them first. And that is not just something where they're going to then sort of feel this gratitude toward you, but that pours outside of the walls of your company, and that gets put out onto your customers. So really, I mean, it's just a proof point of what you were just saying, about how important it is to really build that culture from the inside out. There's also so many ways too that if you're incongruent with how you treat your employees, it's not a walled garden anymore, right? Like, people know. There are so many different ways, whether it's through social or, there's Glassdoor, the, offline word of mouth, the whole deal. It's something that you just can't keep secret. So, that's definitely something to watch out for as a small business owner.
Yeah, which is good for everyone involved, but more challenging for business owners.
Yes.
And there's actually, when you think about building that culture, I think one of the other mistakes that I see a lot of small business owners make is they say, look, I have to hire stars. I only want A players. And the reality is, there's a sociologist, Barron, who studied this across industries. And he shows that if you hire people who are like the next level down in terms of skill, but highly motivated and value generosity and concern for others, that if you just overpay them by a little bit relative to what they're expecting to make, then there's a huge loyalty dividend where they feel like, wow, this is a one of a kind employer. And just that small amount of overpaying, it might be by about 10%, actually wipes out the difference in their performance between them and stars.
Wow.
So you don't actually have to hire people who are outsized performers from the get-go. You just want to hire people who are motivated and skilled and treat them well. Yeah. Sounds simple, right?
Yep.
Done.
Yeah, right. No, that is a great hiring tip for our audience. And that's something else that Tony talks about a lot is, you hire for capacity and attitude. You don't hire for skills or existing experience. And that's something that I think you can definitely get a lot of great talent if you follow those principles.
Yeah, and I see one of the big misinterpretations of hiring for attitude is so many small business owners say, I want to hire for culture fit. Right? I've gotten that, like, you don't have to be the best performer today or the smartest person in the room, but you have to be a fit with our culture. Mm-hmm. And this turns out to work out pretty well when you study startups. The ones that hire primarily on culture fit are far less likely to fail, and they're also more likely to go public in Silicon Valley than the ones that are looking for stars or even just the skills you have today. Mm-hmm. But as the firm grows, culture fit ends up predicting the slowest growth rates when you track market cap and other kinds of metrics. And what happens is that, early on, you're able to bring in these people who lived and breathed the same values, and they were uniquely motivated, and they were all working toward the same mission. Mm-hmm. And then over time, culture fit becomes a proxy for groupthink. And you end up, hiring all these people who think exactly like each other.
Which stifles innovation, right?
Exactly. You weed out diversity of thought.
Yeah.
And so, one of the best antidotes to that I've seen is from IDEO, the great design firm that made the mouse for Apple. IDEO, ran into this problem early, and they said, we've got to throw culture fit out the window. Instead, let's hire on cultural contribution, where when we look at new people, instead of asking, do you match our culture, we're going to ask what's missing from our culture, and then hire the people who are going to enrich it most effectively. And I would love to see more small business owners taking that seriously and saying, look, I've got to analyze what's absent from my culture and then bring those people in, reward them, promote them, as opposed to just trying to clone what's already working in my culture.
Wow, that's great. And it's, definitely, sort of perpetuates the growth of new ideas within the company. And that's something that you talk about in depth in Original. So I just wanted to make a quick shout out to everybody that is listening. So this book, The Originals, it is a #1 national bestseller. It's one of Amazon's best books as of last year. Adam Grant also has written Give and Take, which taps into some of the principles that we talked about today. That was also ranked one of the best books by Amazon, the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal. It was one of Oprah's riveting reads. Harvard Business Review also acknowledged it as one of the best books. So I really, really encourage all of you guys to go out and read more of Adam's work. Adam, just to wrap up, I wanted to ask you, you have a new book in the works. And I know you can't talk about it that much, but I think our audience would love to know what is next and what to look for from you this spring.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. And I'll try to live up to a small fraction of the nice things you just said, Anna. But so new book is coming out April 24th. It's called Option B. I wrote it with Sheryl Sandberg, the Facebook COO and Lean In author. And it's about facing adversity and finding resilience. As I think a lot of people know, Sheryl lost her husband suddenly almost 2 years ago. And we spent a lot of time talking after that about how she could help her kids recover and find strength. And then, what she could do as well in those situations. And we sort of ended up doing a lot of research together and speaking with some remarkable people who had achieved resilience and built resilient communities and companies and families. And we ended up writing a book about how to do that. So looking forward to it coming out soon.
Wow, that sounds fascinating.
And I have to say, when you mentioned at the beginning that Tony was talking to a bunch of entrepreneurs about what he could give to them before they went up on stage, he, without knowing, he actually gave something to me when I was getting ready to go on stage some months ago.
Really?
I spoke at an event that I guess he had been at the previous year, and I walked up and the host said, I just wondered, I see that you were a springboard diver. Have you ever talked to Tony Robbins about his trampoline?
Oh, the rebounder. The rebounder.
Yeah.
Yes.
Said, no. What are you talking about?
Uh-huh.
And he said, well, Tony, before he goes up on stage, he bounces on a trampoline to get his energy up.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, wait, does that mean he only speaks at places that have trampolines? Because as a diver, when we trained, we used to practice on trampolines, and they were like the big gymnastics kind, right, that you see in the Olympics.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And that's what I was picturing. And they're like, no. We bring a little mini trampoline. I'm like, phew.
Yeah. You're like, is it foldable? Does it fit in his suitcase? What's the deal? Yeah.
Yeah, it was such good advice though, because so often, you're just sitting in an audience or, in a dark room before you go on stage, mm-hmm. and then you have to stand up and bring a lot of energy to the table. And it's like going from 0 to 60 in 2.4 seconds.
Yep.
And it was such a powerful reminder for me that I actually need to do something to raise my energy level before I get on stage, as opposed to once I'm on stage. So
yeah,
that was really cool to learn.
I think you should also just start demanding it. Right? Just say before every speaking engagement you have, just put that on your list of things that you require before you go on.
It's tempting. I will see if that's possible.
Anyway, all right. Well, thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
The Tony Robbins podcast is directed and hosted by Tony Robbins and Mary Buckheit. Annie Org is our editorial director and occasional host. The podcast is produced by Carrie Song and Tyler Culbertson. Jamie Carvajal and Adriel De La Torre are our digital editors. Special thanks to Diane Adcock for her creative review. Copyright Robbins Research International.
to all the world. So we have an instinct to go to cultural centers, centers of philosophy, centers of communication. That's where Paul goes, by a clear instinct to Athens. Now, what happens to him when he gets to Athens? And this is the setup for the speech on the Areopagus. It says here, Paul waited for them in Athens, his fellows, and there his whole soul was revolted at the sight of a city given over to idolatry. Worship of false gods. Is that still a problem? Yes, that's always the problem. That's always the problem. That's always the problem. Idolatry, the worship of false gods. Now, they would have had altars to, various deities and so on. No, but heck, we've got altars erected to all kinds of false gods in our culture. So Paul's great revulsion at this, that's deeply biblical. That's his wonderful Jewish prophetic heritage, that we're about the worship of the true God. That's what evangelization means, that we're trying to bring people into the worship of the true God. Ought we to be revolted by all the idolatry we see? Yeah, he was. We should be too. But then now watch. It's not just, oh, isn't this awful? Oh, look at this cultural center, how off-kilter they are, how crazy these people are. No, listen to what he does. In the synagogue, he held debates with the Jews and the God-fearing. Of course, the God-fearing mean Gentiles who have kind of, been sympathetic with the Jewish point of view. Paul almost always goes to the synagogues first, and we see why. His message was, Jesus, risen from the dead, is God's yes to all the promises made to Israel. Who's going to understand that message most readily? Jews. Children of Israel will understand the message. Here's what I want people today to see. When we lose the link between Jesus and Israel, we miss the point. Jesus devolves rapidly into a bland spiritual teacher of timeless truths. Can we distill timeless truths from his teaching? Sure. But what's interesting about Jesus is in his dying and rising, he's the fulfillment of all the promises made to Israel. So this instinct to connect the synagogue and the gospel, good instinct, even for evangelists today. But then listen. And in the marketplace, he had debates every day with anyone who would face him. Now, I like that because I think in our cultural setting today, the social media represent this sort of marketplace of ideas where you confront anybody. So if I give a talk at a church or I go to a Catholic gathering, I'll meet mostly with like-minded people. And that's fine. I'm happy to inform them and inspire them and so on. But I love the fact that the social media represents this kind of open marketplace of ideas. Christians should be willing and able to dialogue with anybody because Jesus said, announce this message to the ends of the world. I love how I heard this from his own lips when I was in Rome many years ago. Pope Benedict was talking about Irenaeus of Lyon, and he was speaking about his anti-Gnostic perspective. And the Gnostics, of course, are like this little private group, right? We have our own little private truth, and we whisper it among ourselves. And Benedict said, I remember he was speaking in French, and he said, for Saint Irenaeus, la foi catholique est publique. Publique, it's public. It's a public pronouncement. That from Paul on, we've been public. We don't whisper our little message among ourselves, but we're willing and able to announce it to the whole world. Love that. Had debates every day with anyone who would listen. Good. We should still keep doing that. And then, this warms my philosopher's heart. Even a few Epicurean and Stoic philosophers argued with him. Good for Paul. Is he talking to average people? Sure. In the synagogue and probably on the street, ordinary people, working class people? Sure, that's part of our job. But who are the Epicureans and Stoics but the leading philosophical minds of the time? And they'd be hanging out in the capital city of Greco-Roman culture. Sure, who are the top philosophers today? Who are they? Christians ought to be able to name them, ought to be able to engage them. Christian evangelists don't just whisper to people at the lower end of the intellectual spectrum. They talk to people at the highest end of the spectrum. Good. We should do all that today. Okay, now watch what happens. So Paul, there he is, in the synagogue, then out in the street, then with the philosophers, debating, speaking, evangelizing. Good. Then this. Some of them said, and these are the Epicureans and Stoics, the high-minded people. Some of them said, does this parrot know what he's talking about? Now, I love this because look at all I'm not enough of a Greek scholar to know the nuances here, but the word being used is ambiguous in the Greek. Because I've seen translations, what is this babbler talking about? And what was it? Scavenger. One translation had it, what's this scavenger going on about? So whatever the word is, it's a disparaging word, right? So they're making fun of Paul. What's this bozo talking about, Well, was he opposed up in the north? Yes. Is he opposed in the cultural capital? Yes, and we shouldn't be surprised. Our Christian evangelists called names all the time by high, cultural figures. Yeah, sure we are. Get used to it. Get used to it. You need a thick skin, in this operation. But it doesn't stop Paul. Now, this is really interesting. This is the Jerusalem Bible I'm reading from here, because there's also ambiguity in the Greek. Here it says, they, the philosophers, invited him to accompany them to the council of the Areopagus. Okay, but other translations are a little more dire, and the language is more like they compelled him to come to the Areopagus to explain himself. So what was the Areopagus? Well, it was, and still is, this kind of extraordinary place. It's this very impressive rocky sort of hill right below the Parthenon, so right smack in the middle of Athens. A place where they had debates, they think, but also where they had trials. Now keep in mind, 400 years before Paul, another famous trial took place in Athens, namely of Socrates, who was accused of atheism and corrupting the youth, right? So some translations suggest, and scholars suggest, this is not just, let's have a friendly chat about what you're saying, that it was closer to a trial, that Paul was kind of on trial for what he was saying. But in any case, there he is in this very public place with the kind of leading figures in the culture of that time. And they're asking him and or challenging him about what he's saying. So with Acts 17, now verse 22, we have the famous speech. And I would urge any evangelist today to read it and to memorize it, what Paul's up to here. Because as I say, it's the master class. Here's how he begins. Men of Athens, I've seen for myself how extremely scrupulous you are in all religious matters, because I noticed as I strolled around admiring your sacred monuments, you had an altar inscribed to an unknown God. Now, interesting thing there. We just heard a few verses earlier that Paul was scandalized by the idolatry of the city. So he was, but now he's doing his speech. What Paul's doing here is what in rhetoric is called the captatio benevolentiae, right? Which is the capturing of the benevolence of your audience. By the way, good rule for any public speaker at any time. You start usually with some kind of self-deprecating remark or a compliment to your crowd. So that's what Paul, who knew Greek rhetoric very well, that's what he's doing. But it's more than that. Because Paul was engaging here in what the Greek fathers would later call the exploration of the logoi spermatikoi, which just means the seeds of the word. So Paul's got the Word, right? The Word made flesh in Jesus. But there are hints and echoes and anticipations of that Word in whatever is good, true, and beautiful in the culture you're evangelizing. So Paul's saying, hey, I've been walking around your city, and even though in one side of his heart saying, look at all this idolatry, but he also saying, I get it. You're a religious people. There's a religious instinct in you. Now, from Paul through Thomas Aquinas to G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis and everybody else, that's a really good instinct to follow, is to find what the Latins call the semina verbi, the seeds of the word, in whatever culture you're in. My mentor, Cardinal George, always said, and Cardinal George, who could be very sharply critical of the culture, but he said, you can't finally evangelize a culture you don't love, which has always struck me as perfectly right. If you just hate the culture, you're just at war with it, you will not evangelize it effectively. So Paul, by a very good instinct, looks for the seeds of the word. As I say, you can't imagine Augustine without that move. You can't imagine Aquinas without that move. You can't imagine John Paul II without that move. So very important for evangelizers. But that's not all he does. If that's all you do, that's if you want the left-wing problem, that you just see Christianity as one more example of a cultural religious form. Listen now as Paul goes on. Since the God who made the world and everything in it is himself Lord of heaven and earth, he does not make his home in shrines made by human hands. Now, mind you, where is he standing as he says that? And that's what struck me when I went to the Areopagus in Athens. He's standing right below, like it's right up there, the Parthenon, which was the greatest pagan religious temple in the world. At the heart of it was this, now long gone, but giant statue of the goddess Athena. Paul's saying, hey, the God I'm talking about does not make his home in shrines made by human hands, like yours here. So, having complimented them, he immediately critiques the idolatry within the culture. That rhythm, that move, is typical of evangelists at their best. It avoids, if you want, the extremes of both left and right. It's the yes to the culture and the great no to the culture, all as a propedeutic to what? The declaration of the novelty of the good news. Listen to this now as Paul continues this speech. Now he, God, is telling everyone everywhere they must repent, because he's fixed a day when the whole world will be judged, and judged in righteousness. And he's appointed a man to be the judge. And God has publicly proved this by raising this man from the dead. Now he's talking about the heart of the gospel, Jesus risen from the dead. Compliments the culture, critiques the culture, as a preparation for the declaration of this decisive manifestation of the Logos, Jesus risen from the dead. Christian evangelists don't shy away from this. They don't permanently put it off. Your ultimate purpose is the declaration of Christ risen from the dead. Okay, now just one more point. At this mention of rising from the dead, some of them burst out laughing. So, when I read this now, I think, Brother Paul, I'm with you, man. I get it. The number of times, like in my social media outreach, the number of times I've been, for want of a better term, laughed at for things I say, they're countless. The culture has always found, finds, will always find the Christian proclamation crazy. Some in the culture always will, because it is this kind of crazy good news of Jesus having gone to death, now risen from the dead, and the source of grace for the world. Strange message? It always was. Don't believe people today that say, those ancient people, they bought any old crazy nonsense. The pre-scientific, poor things, they believed in these, crazy people coming back from the dead. No, they didn't. Listen, they were pre-scientific, they weren't stupid. They knew dead people stayed in their graves. Of course they did. And so they laugh at this claim that Paul was making. My point is not to deny the resurrection, it's to say it's always been a strange and disturbing message. But yet Paul confidently proclaims it. Now, I love this, how it ends. After that, Paul left them, but there were some who attached themselves to him and became believers. Among them, Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman called Damaris, and some others besides. Now, you're Paul. You're the Apostle Paul. You've seen the risen Christ. You want to proclaim him to the world. You've gone to the cultural capital of your world. You've gone to Athens. You've debated with philosophers. You've gone to the Areopagus itself. You proclaimed this message. And what's your payoff? Well, a lot of them laughed at you. Most walked away. And a couple of people said, maybe where's that line again? Others said, we'd like to hear you talk about this again. That's the payoff. That's what Paul got, right? Could you understand if Paul went back to his room that night and thought, okay, well, that was kind of a bomb. That evangelical outreach, that didn't go very well. But wait, who are Dionysius the Areopagite? Who's this woman called Damaris and others besides? But the seeds from which European Christianity developed, right? This is Paul now planting the faith in Europe. As it grew through Europe, it eventually grew to the ends of the world. So the fact that I'm recording these words on the distant shore of a continent Paul never even knew existed. But the beginning of it were these handful of people that said, yeah, okay, we'll listen to you again on this, you know. Final lesson to evangelists, don't get discouraged at what appear to be poor results of your work. Who's listening to me? Who cares about this? I mean, come on, I'm wasting my time. You have no idea what God can do with a couple little seeds that were planted by your proclamation of the word. So anyway, take a look at get your Bibles out and Acts 17 and the speech of Paul on the Areopagus, masterclass for evangelizers.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Matt Nelson, the Assistant Director of the Word on Fire Institute, and I'm here live on location in the examination schools at Oxford University in Oxford, England, and I'm here with Bishop Robert Barron. In just a few moments, I'm going to be asking Bishop Barron questions submitted from our Word on Fire Institute members about the life, thought, and ministry of St. John Henry Newman. But first, I want to invite you, if you're not a Word on Fire Institute member, to go to wordonfire.institute and sign up right now. When you become a member of the Institute, you'll have access to courses from top experts on disciplines like theology, philosophy, sociology, apologetics, evangelization, literature, and other fields of expertise. But most importantly, you'll have access to Bishop Barron's brand new 12-lesson course on St. John Henry Newman. So go to wordonfire.institute and sign up now. And with that, let's jump into questions. Bishop Barron, how are you today?
I'm good. Great to be with you, Matt.
Good. So the first question I want to ask you is just about your experience. Just a couple days ago, you were in Rome for the canonization of now St. John Henry Newman. What was that like for you?
It was a thrill. Right there in St. Peter's Square, and I've admired Newman for so many years. When I used to teach courses of Newman, I would tell the students, now mark my words, he'll be a saint one day and a doctor of the church. So I kept thinking during the Mass, well, we're halfway there. Newman's now a saint. I was struck too by just all the historical and spiritual resonances in that place. There's the successor of Peter celebrating the Mass. We're right near the grave of St. Peter. We chanted the gospel that day in Latin and Greek, and I thought how Newman would have loved that because it evoked the church fathers. So all those wonderful resonances. And then during the Mass, I was right up in the front there near the altar, and looking up on the facade of the basilica was this magnificent tapestry of John Henry Newman. And I just kept thinking, boy, did he ever, in his wildest imaginings, think when he arrived in Rome as a middle-aged man in about 1846, that he'd be declared a saint of the Catholic Church? And it just struck me over and over again the wonderful kind of ironies and connections and resonances. So it was a beautiful day.
Yeah, I caught some of it, and it was a beautiful Mass. It was really moving to see all 5 of the new saints canonized that day, and so really exciting. And so now we're here in Oxford. You've been here before, and you know, this was an exciting thing for the Word on Fire Institute members because they got to contribute to this very event that we're engaging in right now. They submitted questions that they wanted you to address while we're here, and so based on those questions, I've got those here for you today, some questions that I put together. So the first question that I want to ask you, and I think this is fitting with us sitting here in the oldest English-speaking university in the world, maybe even the most renowned university in the world, to ask you, what did St. John Henry Newman have to say about universities?
Yeah, first you're right in suggesting that this is Newman's town in many ways. He was an Oxford man. It defined him his whole life long. Even after he became a Catholic and left his formal teaching and fellowship here, he remained an Oxford man. It was in his blood and his bones. And of course, he writes the magnificent Idea of a University, one of his great texts, still of enormous influence today. I think what Newman saw, so many things, but one is the importance of a truly liberal education. So we're obsessed, especially now, with practicality with mechanics, with how to get things done, to be practical. Even our higher disciplines, think of engineering and so on, are usually geared toward something pragmatic. Newman insisted upon the value of a properly liberal education, liberal from the word in Latin for free, and that means free of practicality. In other words, something which is not subordinated to a good outside of itself, but is sought for its own sake. So that's Aristotle's famous definition, that the liberal sciences are those that are the highest because they're good in themselves. Just like playing baseball is something liberal, meaning you don't do it for some other purpose, you do it because it's good. Well, philosophy is like that. And Newman felt that the purpose of a university ultimately is to produce the philosophical habit. So studying all the various disciplines, yes, but the overall purpose was to give this sort of universal view of things, the interrelationship among the various disciplines, and to see them as good in themselves, as beautiful and valuable in themselves. And that, I think, remains to this day an extremely important and valuable contribution.
What did Saint John Henry Newman, that sounds good, what did he have to say about the university in terms of helping somebody become a gentleman? That was the word he used when he talked about the purpose of a liberal arts education and developing this philosophical habit.
Yeah, and that's it. That's shorthand for what I was just describing. The person that has the philosophical habitus would be a gentleman. And as an Englishman, he rated gentlemanliness as a very high level. But the interesting thing is Newman said, that's the purpose of a university. The purpose of the church is to make not the gentleman, but the saint. And he defined the saint really over and against the gentleman in some ways. Gentlemen, he said, make you feel comfortable and at ease. They're like a fine fire or a comfortable chair. Saints, last time I checked and last time he checked, were often anything but comfortable figures. They were edgy and challenging and disturbing figures. Think of everyone from Jeremiah the prophet through Jerome and Francis of Assisi and in our time Mother Teresa. They're not really comfortable figures. So that was an important distinction. Yes, the university, which inculcates the philosophical habit, produces gentlemen, but the church is meant to produce something else, namely the saint.
So could we see a university as a sort of precursor to then the church, in the sense that becoming a gentleman or becoming gentlemanly is in a way preparing somebody but not getting them the whole way to being holy?
Yeah, there's something of the nature-grace distinction there. So Newman affirmed being a gentleman. He wasn't against it at all, on the contrary. But being a saint was something beyond it. So it's not eschewing nature or denigrating it, but then also insisting there's something more than that. So that was the tension built into those essays on the university. He loved the university, loved what it was about, loved what it was meant to produce. But he didn't want to reduce sanctity to being a gentleman. He didn't want to reduce the purpose of the church to the purpose of a university. So he kept, I would say, a healthy tension between nature and grace.
Good. Let's stick with this conversation about the university for another question. I'm interested to know, do you think that St. John Henry Newman would have thought that theology belonged in even the secular universities? And how do you personally feel about that?
No, he clearly did. And by theology there, he wouldn't have meant so much the formal theology of the church. He would have meant what they called in those days natural theology. So theology based upon reason, philosophical reason. And Newman felt, if it's a university, that means it has to include all the disciplines. Why wouldn't you include the discipline that speaks of God? Because God impinges upon all things. Is God operative in history? Yes, obviously. Does God inspire much of the literature of the world? Obviously. Is God implicated in the sciences? Well, sure, in the measure that all the sciences depend upon the intelligibility of the world, which in turn is a result of creation, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And so how could you be a university in good faith if you didn't have a discipline dedicated to that which impinges upon everything else? Furthermore, and I think it's a very important part of his argument, is theology belongs in the center of the university disciplines. And there Newman echoes someone like Bonaventure in the Middle Ages. When you extricate theology from the position in the center, nature pours a vacuum. Something else will move into that central position. And Newman saw that very clearly mid-19th century. Do we see it today? I would say in spades, precisely in the scientism that dominates our intellectual life. What's moved into the center of all the disciplines but science? I can't tell you how many times in my work, on the internet, people will say some version of, well, science is what you mean by reason. To be reasonable is to be scientific, right? And I say, well, wrong. Science is indeed a form of reasonability, but not the only one. And what's happened there is the supplanted theology has now been replaced by science. When I was coming of age, psychology maybe had that central, all-defining position. Beware, said Newman in the mid-19th century, when that happens, you'll have a distortion of all the disciplines. When theology is, as the Middle Ages saw it, the Regina Scientiarum, right? It was the queen of the sciences.
Right.
When it was in the properly central position, the other sciences maintained their integrity. I think that observation remains enormously important today.
In your course on St. John Henry Newman, you talk about this, you go into greater depth. And as I was contemplating what you teach in that course and then thinking about the questions I'd be asking you today, as I was thinking about theology in the secular university, I thought of a comment once made by Paul Davies. He's a renowned physicist and he's an agnostic. But he commented once on modern science and the advancements in science, what it now tells us almost forces us now into a sort of theological position. And so that's another thing I think to consider when we talk about theology in the secular university.
Wasn't he the one, in fact, who challenged his scientific colleagues? Where do the laws of nature come from? So, all of science rests upon this fundamental assumption of intelligibility, and we put that in terms of the laws of science. Call them even patterns of probability if you want, but all of science rests upon that. And wasn't it he who, in a famous article, challenged his colleagues to say, okay, where'd that come from?
He has, I'm not sure, but he has been a voice in the scientific community that has challenged his colleagues. And as an agnostic, he's written a couple books and has
right, that he is indeed an agnostic, but that he thought that was a fair question to tease out.
Yeah.
Like, all right, well, then give me your best account of it.
Yeah.
Why should the world be structured in such a way that it corresponds to the most complex type of mathematics? Look at the highest level physics, always involves very complex mathematics. Why should it be the case that reality is describable in that way?
Yeah.
Well, we would say the intelligibility of the world is grounded in something like an intelligence that has thought it into being, so that every act of science, as Ratzinger once said, is a recognitio, right? It's a recognition. It's a rethinking of what's already been thought. That's how I would answer that question.
Yeah.
And why I think something like theology, or call it natural theology, belongs in the circle of university disciplines.
Yeah, and something that he's doing that I think Newman would have respected is the fact that he sees that faith and reason have a sort of compatibility between the two. And so he's agnostic, but he's not resting easily in agnosticism. He's open to the conversation.
And that's a salutary thing today, when you've got a lot of the scientistic point of view. The new atheists are dripping with scientism, and they'll play that card over and over again, but it's such a self-refuting card in a way, because the sciences can't explain their own ground. They can't articulate on their own terms the ground upon which they stand.
Right.
You need a higher discipline to do that. The classical authors understood that, and we go back to Aristotle, understood that. Aquinas would have understood that. Newman understood it, and that's something needed today.
Yeah, we could keep going on that topic for a long time, but I know this is a question that our Word on Fire Institute members will be waiting for, and that's basically for book recommendations. Now, let's talk about Newman's books for a moment. Two questions. One is, what do you think, objectively speaking, is the most important book that Newman wrote for us today? The second part of the question is, for you personally, what's been the most significant book he wrote for you?
Yeah, your first question, I guess I would say The Grammar of Assent, that magnificent late career masterpiece of Newman's that's full of so many important distinctions and clarifications and insights. The fact that Bernard Lonergan, who wrote his great book, Insight, in the mid-20th century, said he read Newman's grammar something like 12 times before he sat down to write Insight, I think what we're getting from the grammar, the importance of probability rather than certitude as the best epistemic guide. And here's what I mean. Now you can trace some of this back to people like Plato, but in the modern period, Descartes bequeathed to the West, I would say, a certain obsession with certitude, you know? How can you be certain of something? And so Descartes, as we know, famously doubts all that can be doubted. Coming up finally with the cogito, the one thing you can't doubt is that you're a doubter. So I think, therefore I am. But now, watch all the great modern thinkers that follow him. They're too obsessed with this question of certitude. Newman said the grammar came from an insight, namely, don't start with certitude, start with assent. Why do we give assent to propositions? We say, yes, that's true. Now, why do we do that? And Newman said, we hardly ever do it because we have apodictic inferential support for it. So I assent to that because I've got an absolutely convincing argument that no one could deny. That's hardly ever the case. Rather, as he famously says, it's typically from a whole congeries of arguments indeed, but also, insights and hunches and examples and experiences that all converge to the same place. And that leads me, by this inner sense he called the illative sense, it leads me to say, finally, yes, that's true. His famous example being, how do you know Great Britain's an island? We don't have an apodictic, syllogistic argument to come to that conclusion, but it's based, as he says, on all sorts of insights, examples, histories, your own personal experience, all coming together around the conclusion that Great Britain's an island. That's the way the mind typically functions. And see, I like that a lot. It gets you out of the Cartesian obsession with certitude and aligns you more toward understanding. Come into a deeper understanding of things by a process both intellectual and experiential, emotional, etc. I think that epistemic move is of extraordinary importance for our own time.
I want to get back to the grammar of assent.
Well, who doesn't want to get back?
Well, maybe we need to read it 14 times before we can really have a conversation about it, like Lonergan. But let's, before we go back to that book, talk a little bit about your personal choice, which has been most significant for you.
Well, for me, it's the Apologia Pro Vita Sua. It's his autobiography. And the reason for that is when I was a kid at the University of Notre Dame, and I was just thinking about the priesthood at that point. And I met with this wonderful priest, Father Tom McNally, still alive in his mid-90s now. And we were talking away, and he sensed that I had intellectual interests. He said, I think a book you should read is John Henry Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua, and he described it as his autobiography. Well, I had heard of neither Newman nor the book at that point, but I went to the Notre Dame bookstore, and I found it. And I still have it. I bought this little red-covered paperback, about this big. Now it's all wrinkled and dog-eared. I think I glanced at it when I was 18, and it meant so little to me. I didn't really understand it, and I put it aside. But many years later, I came back to that book. And as you know, it's Newman sort of telling of the story of his conversion, how he moves, from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism. But there's something so compelling about that story, and so rich, and so beautifully told. It's being written around the same time as Dickens's novels and all that. And it came out the same way Dickens' novels came out, like in installations. And people would stand in line to wait for the next installment, of the Apologia. It's had that impact on me as I've read it over the years, as I've taught it. Newman's story, it's a bit like Augustine's story, that his own life becomes a template that a lot of people follow and fit their own lives into. So that book has meant a lot to me, and as I say, that little red paperback, I still have it. How many years later is that? 40-some years later. Yeah. And it means a lot to me. And
that book was autobiographical, but it was a defense.
Yeah, and Apologia.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, he was accused by a fellow named Charles Kingsley, who was an Anglican controversialist at the time, and he accused Newman of being indifferent to the truth, and it was based on an earlier sermon that Newman. Well, that was like waving a red, cape before a bull. Because Newman was dedicated, hyper-dedicated to the truth. But he answered Kingsley. Kingsley answered back, and Newman thought, okay, to answer this sufficiently, I need to tell my whole story.
Right.
And so the book comes out of that experience.
Yeah, well, and the fact that that it's being written with that kind of a tone of answering somebody who has challenged him, gives the book a really interesting feel when you're reading through it.
And see, Newman was not so much a pure intellectual, meaning someone that looked at ideas for their own sake. He was always a controversialist, and I think he would have embraced that description more than theologian. He often said, "I'm not a theologian. I'm not like Augustine or Aquinas."
Yeah.
He was more of an apologist or a controversialist, more of an intellectual kind of street fighter, meaning he was always engaged with someone. And I think his purpose was to bring people to conversion. He himself had undergone this conversion, and he wanted everyone else to as well. He wanted to bring people to what he felt was the fullness of the faith.
Yeah.
So there was always kind of a fighting edge. And man, was he a good satirist, and he had a bit of a poison pen. I mean, if you got on Newman's wrong side, he'll let you have it, literarily speaking.
Right. Yeah. No. But yet there's always a tone of charity, even though he's at times in a sort of appropriate and balanced way coming on strong.
Yeah, he's polemical.
Yeah.
But so was Augustine, so was Jerome, so was Chrysostom. Read most of the fathers. I mean, they're very polemical.
And compelling.
I think he would have gotten it from them more than from his own time. He would have gotten it from reading the church fathers.
Yeah, well, when we were talking about key influencers in his conversion, who did you say were the key influencers for his conversion from Anglicanism to Catholicism?
I would say the fathers. Yeah. And it's not, and there were some people in his own time, some Catholics that he was reading. But I would say the prime influence were the church fathers. His area of great interest was the controversies of the 4th century. And it was this study of those controversies that led him finally to say, I see a disturbing analogy between the Anglicanism of my own time and the heretical positions of the ancient world. And so I think it was a careful reading of the fathers that led him finally to his conversion to Catholicism.
Yeah. Well, let's jump back now to the grammar of assent, because what I'd like you to do for our viewers is, could you draw the distinction between real and notional assent? Those are two terms that Newman discusses a lot in that book, and I think they're very applicable to our time now. Can you talk about, number one, what he meant by those terms, but also then, in your method of evangelization, which usually involves beauty as the arrowhead of the whole program, talk about how Newman's thought on real and notional assent ultimately leads then to your strategy for evangelization today. Yeah.
The distinction really is a simple one. A notional assent is one that I give to an abstraction or a proposition, an idea. Mm-hmm. And Newman loved propositions and abstractions and ideas, and he realized that notional assent always has a role to play in our coming to know things correctly. So that's the first type. But it's sharply to be distinguished from real assent, which is the assent I give to particulars, to this experience, to this image. It's always correlated to something very factual in front of me, nuts and bolts. And see, there I would see the influence of another important Oxford figure, namely Duns Scotus. Go right back to the Middle Ages. Duns Scotus felt that the epistemology he inherited from the classical world and that Thomas Aquinas represented was still way too abstract. And so Scotus has this idea of haixeitas, which is particularity. He coined that term. It means thisness. So I can abstract the form of glass from this object. But he thought the mind didn't want just that. It wanted, what's this thing, this particular, what's the haixeitas, the form of particularity? There's a lot of that in Newman, I think. And that corresponds to what he called real assent. Now, both are involved in the process of coming to know. He did not have a contempt for the first, and it wasn't a simple-minded distinction. But he did feel that it's real assent that moves us to action. That if you want to move people to change, to do something, you'd appeal more to the real than to the notional. We had the privilege today of going out to Blenheim Palace and visiting the tomb of Churchill, and I always felt Churchill got this in his bones. I mean, Churchill was someone obviously who knew how to use propositions and ideas, but when Churchill wanted to move this country to action. All I've got to give you is blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We're going to fight on the beaches. We're going to fight on the landing grounds. We're going to fight, with increasing strength in the air. We're going to fight. And notice there, Newman would have appreciated this. He's using very Anglo-Saxon words there. Because in English, we have that wonderful confluence of two streams. There's the more Latinate stream that came from French, and then there's the more Anglo-Saxon stream. And we associate the Latinate words with propositions, the Anglo-Saxon words with the real, right? So Churchill was giving us blood, toil, tears, sweat, fight, beaches. It's all Anglo-Saxon words. Real assent language moves people to action. So Newman wanted to move people to action. Why? Because he was a Catholic apologist. He wanted to bring people to the Catholic faith, to undergo a conversion. And therefore you needed, he thought, primarily real assent to make that happen.
So talk a little bit then about, before we get into the beauty portion of the question, talk about now illative sense and the illative sense and how that applies to these ideas.
Well, the illative sense is the epistemic correlate to something like conscience.
Okay.
So, conscience is able to assess the situation and take things in and then say, this is the direction I should go in, morally speaking. Think of like prudence, Now put it in the epistemic context. As I assess this hunch, this insight, this experience, this idea, this argument, this witness, and I assess all of it, and I see them all converging at one point. It's the illative sense, Newman felt, that leads me to assent, that says, yes, it brings together, it assesses, it correlates all of these influences, and then moves the mind to assent. So it's a sensibility.
Okay.
Would
you say that the illative sense in a way brings together the notional and the real?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Right. It would help to bring all of it together. And that's the way, here's where the rubber meets the road, because that's how we, in fact, 99% of the time, make decisions. Why we say, yes, that's true. We can hardly ever say, oh, let me show you the argument. Premise A, premise B, conclusion. Got it? That's why we hardly ever operate that way. That might be part of it. There might be an argument I could conjure up. But usually it's by this whole complex process. And the illative sense is that feel. It's like when people ask me, how come you became a priest? Well, I can never give an answer.
Right.
Or someone say, how come you married your wife? You can't just come up with, well, here's major premise, minor premise, conclusion.
Yeah.
There's a whole variety, in my case of becoming a priest, of reasons why. The illative sense, is what assesses all of that and leads me to say, yes, I'm going to make this change in my life and become a priest. Or in your case, I'm going to marry this woman. And I think Newman had great psychological insight. He was not a in the clouds philosopher when it came to the act of knowing. He was a psychologically perceptive man.
So, yeah, Newman was interested not just in saying yes, but then acting upon that yes. And you talk about how beauty has this power to move us into action, essentially.
Yeah.
So then what's the relationship between how beauty acts on us and how we experience real assent?
Yeah, well, that's a good example of it. It's because, I can be, moving in the direction of believing in God, but then I walk into Chartres Cathedral, and I see the rose window, and I see that place, and it has that weird, almost alchemical influence on me. It starts changing me, I think of the famous Cardinal Lustiger, who was Archbishop of Paris when I was a student there many years ago. A Jew, his mother died in the Shoah, and he was sent to a Catholic family for kind of safekeeping during the Holocaust. And he wanders one day into one of the great Gothic cathedrals, and that changed him. Or the famous example of Paul Claudel, the great French playwright, standing in I know exactly where it was, at Notre Dame in Paris, looking up at the rose window, and that's when it came together. It was the beautiful that, and to use Newman's language now, I think prompted this real assent to the proposition that God is real, God exists. My life has to change. And I'm sure both Lustiger and Claudel knew arguments, and I wouldn't discount for a minute that they played a role. I think in my own life, an argument for God's existence when I was a kid played a big role in moving me to a deeper appreciation of religion. But I would never say, oh, that's it. It's this argument. That's why, no, it was the beginning of a process. It was a magnet around which a lot of things gathered, But I think Newman is especially sensitive to the complexity of this psychological and epistemic process by which we come to assent.
Yeah, and he had a real gift for seeing the complexity, but then writing in a really engaging way, as profound and sometimes as careful as you have to be reading him. Theologically speaking, he's had great influence, and you talk about his influence at the Second Vatican Council. The ironic thing is, he was dead by the time the Second Vatican Council came around.
Right, but I've said he's maybe the most important dead person at Vatican II. So there were a lot of important players at the council, the periti, the theological experts. But among the heavenly players, I'd put Newman near the front rank, because think of so many of the periti at Vatican II, de Lubac and Bouillet and Danielou and Ratzinger. Balthasar wasn't there, but he was very influenced by Newman. All these people carried a very Newman-esque influence. You know what it was, Matt, I think? It was the importance of the church fathers. Newman is a proto-Nouvelle Théologie figure in this way. The Nouvelle Théologie figures, mid-20th century, tended to leap over the Middle Ages and the Reformation and those debates, and they went back on purpose to the church fathers. And they found a time when Christianity was united. So before the great splits, whether it's the 1054 split or the 1517 split, they went back before those. And they found this sort of compelling Christian space of the church fathers. Well, who anticipated all that? 100 years before the Nouvelle Théologie, John Henry Newman. He had nothing but respect for Thomas Aquinas, but Thomas Aquinas and the scholastic method are conspicuous by their absence in Newman. What do you find in Newman? Instead, the fathers, the fathers, the fathers. And I think that's what influenced your de Lubacs and Bouillets and Balthasars and Ratzingers. And they, in turn, massively influenced the Vatican Council. Thomas, again, I have nothing but reverence for Thomas myself, but he's also relatively absent from the Vatican II documents. But they are redolent of the church fathers. That's very much of a Newman impact, I think, at Vatican II. But he's certainly a major player.
What was it that John Tracy Ellis said about Newman that really caught your attention?
This was many years ago. I was a first-year philosophy student at Catholic University. I was getting my master's degree, my first year in the master's program. And I was at theological college, and to our house for daily mass this one night came the famous John Tracy Ellis, who at the time was about 80, maybe, and he was generally regarded as the dean of American Catholic Church historians. He was the great figure. Wrote the great biography of Cardinal Gibbons. He was Cardinal Dolan's thesis director. Oh, really? So a very major player, And he gave this wonderful, it was atypical at the time, believe me, but this wonderful classic stem-winding sort of sermon, in the course of which he said, as a kind of, obiter dictum, he said, John Henry Newman, the greatest Catholic theologian since Thomas Aquinas. And I was a kid, and I knew Newman from Father Tom McNally telling you about this book, but I knew almost nothing about him. But I tucked that away. I thought, wow, this very weighty figure has just said that the greatest theologian since Thomas Aquinas is John Henry Newman. And I tucked that away thinking, boy, I've got to read this fellow someday with greater care, which I did. But Ellis played a role in my own, appreciation of Newman.
It's been interesting to see how St. John Henry Newman and St. Thomas Aquinas have both influenced you.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know, maybe in a way it's reminiscent of Herbert McCabe, who many people called a Thomist, but himself didn't like that label, and he was influenced by so many different people.
But McCabe is I think, a wonderful Thomist.
Yeah.
But reads Thomas in a very fresh way.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say both Aquinas and Newman have influenced me, even though Newman, as I say, wasn't really very Thomist and didn't have a lot in common with Thomas, but for me, they're very complementary figures. I say, the great Catholic both and is on display there. Bring them both on, I like both Newman and Thomas.
Yeah, you've kind of been a master of finding the best of what everybody has to offer and then making something of that. And I think that really is something for all of us to learn in this time, in this culture, when we're setting out to evangelize, do apologetics. There's so much to learn about this from so many different angles, so many different influencers.
Right. Well, I've always hated that. I'm glad you bring that up, because I've always hated that way of reading the tradition. As though there's one voice who's just got it right, and then with everybody else, all I'm going to do is notice how they disagree with the one voice I think is really right. It's such an ungenerous and finally un-Catholic way to read. And I'll take as exhibit A, Thomas Aquinas himself. How did he read the great intellectual tradition? With a tremendous generosity of spirit. Thomas wasn't dwelling on the mistakes of those that came before him. On the contrary, he tends to say, here's what's wonderful in Aristotle, here's what's wonderful in Plato, here's what's really worthwhile in Cicero. Here, by the way, is what's really worthwhile in Moses Maimonides, my rabbi, colleague intellectually. Here's what's really interesting and important in Averroes and Avicenna and Avicebron, my Islamic colleagues. Did he disagree with all those people? Yes, very clearly. But it's a generous way of reading the intellectual tradition. What I don't like is that sort of cramped, defensive, very un-Catholic way to read the tradition, whereby I choose one figure who is he's it, that's the person, and everyone else I'm going to snipe at them and show how wrong they are. Where's that get us? I would say, why not benefit from all these great figures? Yeah. Look, I'm a Thomist. I disagree with key elements in Duns Scotus, but I just sang the praises of Duns Scotus 20 minutes ago because I think there are wonderful things in Duns Scotus. Yeah. So anyway, I just think that's a sort of meta point, but don't read the Catholic tradition in that cramped, defensive way. It doesn't help. Read it as generously as Aquinas did.
And be open to anywhere you hear the truth.
And that's what Thomas said. Yeah. Wherever the truth is found, God has spoken there. Thomas says that. So you hear the truth from an Islamic scholar. Good. God's spoken there. And who would ever accuse of Thomas Aquinas of being somehow a religious relativist? But he had that generous way of approaching the intellectual tradition.
And Newman was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. And even with Darwin's thought, Newman wasn't outright opposed to what Darwin had to say. What did Newman say about Darwin's theory of evolution? Was he open to that?
Well, he was, and rather unusually for the time, he was a Christian who said, I don't think this poses any sort of threat to authentic Catholic orthodoxy. And there were Christians who were deeply concerned about Darwin. I think Newman was very much ahead of his time. He was also very interested in mathematics and the sciences. And I think that's very hopeful. I'd also say this about Newman and Darwin. As you say, writing right around the same time. They were both part of this Lebensphilosophie movement. So think of a figure like Hegel in Germany. Lebensphilosophie means philosophy of life, or life philosophy. The stress was on how things develop and unfold, and how events and ideas and so on are alive across history. They're not simply statically given, right? So much of classical philosophy is predicated upon the assumption that you've got static essences and forms that are simply given. Now, Newman didn't deny essences and forms, but he tended to see how they unfold themselves across space and time. So think of Newman's essay on the development of doctrine as a kind of parallel text in a way to The Origin of Species. So Darwin showing how species, in fact, unfold over space and time. So ideas unfold over space and time. Controversial at its time? Yeah, it sure was, Newman's theory. Generally accepted at Vatican II? Absolutely. Something I find intriguing is that Vatican II itself is a sort of ratification of Newman's theory. What do you find at Vatican II when you read those documents carefully is not a repudiation of anything that came before, but rather a development of doctrine. How can you read Lumen Gentium, for example, and not see real development in regard to ecclesiology? How can you read Dignitatis Humanae and not see development in regard to the kind of church-state relationship question? Newman insisted every legitimate development has a conservative action upon its past. So he's no relativist. He's not in favor of radical ruptures. But development, you bet. And Vatican II, by its very nature in a way, ratifies that point of view. That brings him close to Darwin, it seems to me, in sort of a Lebensphilosophie context.
So then, on that topic of interacting with people who we would not perhaps agree much with, who we wouldn't hold faith in common with, interacting with non-believers, today in the world of popular apologetics, I mean, the popular arguments are usually cosmological arguments or design arguments, which are great. They have a place. But Newman took a unique approach because he began with the conscience, didn't he, when it came to the existence of God?
Yeah, and he knew, of course, the tradition of the more cosmological arguments. Mm-hmm. He knew in his own time, Paley, who proposed the famous, watchmaker. Right. It's kind of a design argument. Mm-hmm. Newman was very impatient with those. He didn't exactly repudiate them, but he was impatient with them. One reason is they dealt so much at the notional level, and he felt that they wouldn't move people to real change. Mm-hmm. And also, relatedly, they didn't come to the particularity of the God of the Bible. Now, what did? He searched for a real access to God. Is there a possibility of giving real assent? And his answer was, yeah, through conscience. Because the conscience gives me, he felt, a vivid, visceral experience of a moral judge. Someone, that's why we speak of the voice of the conscience, as opposed to like my aesthetic sensibility, let's say, or even like the illative sense. But conscience, we say, it's the voice. I heard the voice of my conscience. Now, why? Because it puts us in the presence, he felt, of a judge who sees my interior life and determines that, you're acting rightly or wrongly. What does it give me? Not just a sense of, some distant first cause, but of a living person who's present to me in the sort of intimacy of my interior life, who is a moral judge, who rewards and punishes, who is of providential import. Mm-hmm. All of that, Newman felt, brought you much more in line with a biblical understanding of God. And it made the experience of God unavoidable, and it pushed you to action. So his approach to apologetics is precisely that. Begin with the conscience, and you'll get to the biblical idea of God.
Good. Well, apologetics, properly understood, is part of our task of increasing Christian unity throughout the world. And I wish we could sit here for another hour and go through so many more questions, because there were so many more good questions.
We're out of questions? Or
we got one more left for today. So I'm going to go right to the last question I wanted to ask you before we wrap this up. And that is, what does St. John Henry Newman have to teach us, especially Catholics and Anglicans, about moving towards greater unity among us?
It's a good question, and there's a number of ways to answer it. What comes to my mind, though, is this, especially today. The distinctions and fights among ourselves maybe aren't as important as our common fight against a common enemy. And what I mean is, all biblical people, all people of faith, are standing against right now a very aggressive secularism. Denies the existence of God, denies the existence of objective moral values, denies much of the classical, biblical view of things. Anglicans and Catholics could sort of fight and fuss about what still divides us, mm-hmm. or we could make common cause as biblical people and say we got to enter into the lists against this very aggressive secularism. And that might be a way to find real unity in a common shared battle. Something I often say in ecumenical conversations when I have them now is that, look, we could fight about the 16th century till the cows come home. We've been doing it for 500 years. Mm-hmm. Or we can make common cause, And I think that might be an instinct that Newman would have had.
And we've made some advances, especially with the Church of England and over the years.
Oh, indeed. No, yeah. Quite right. And we could explore that line. You're quite right. But I just wonder, it might be the best way to find real unity today is make common cause against this, rather rather threatening enemy.
Well, thanks so much, Bishop Barron. I wish we could go through more questions. We've definitely got more questions to look at, but maybe for a future time.
Love it.
So for all of you watching, go to wordonfire.institute. Join the Word on Fire Institute, where you can become a member and take in Bishop Barron's brand new course. Go to wordonfire.institute. We'd love to have you aboard. And Bishop Barron, would you want to give us some last words and maybe a final blessing?
Sure. The last word would just be gratitude, Matt, to you and to all the viewers. I'm so happy Newman now canonized. We pray to Newman, and I hope this canonization draws greater attention to him and to his writings. I think he remains for people today very much of a pivotal player, so I'm pleased about that. And let me give a final blessing to our viewers. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit come down upon you and remain with you forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen.